listeners, and welcome to the Flore, where we talk about fantasy and lore from the ground up. I'm your host, Aaron.
I'm Joe Bendusky.
And I'm Eli.
So if you've already heard the narrative portion of this, if you're unfamiliar, there's a story portion, and then there is a lore discussion. And right now we're exploring the world of Dungeons and Dragons, and specifically the world of Eberron. So if you've seen our clip, then you met Kasric, the gnome wizard, as he was shipwrecked on the coast off of Korthos. In this discussion, we're going to be talking about the world he's in, which is Eberron, and the differentiating that from probably anything you're familiar with in Dungeons and Dragons, which is the Forgotten Realms, and kind of introducing you to this world. And we've picked a very specific piece of that world that's very iconic and can really help differentiate the two. So the first thing I'll talk about is Forgotten Realms versus Eberron, and why there's a difference and what that matters. So if you've ever played or heard of games like Baldur's Gate or the Dritz novels or Daggerdale, Neverwinter's Night, all of that takes place in the world of the Forgotten Realms, not Eberron. And so while these are both Dungeons and Dragons worlds, there are some big differences. The Forgotten Realms is older, both in the mythology of the world, but also just in the real world creation. The Forgotten Realms was created first. If we start there with the creation of the Forgotten Realms. Oh, go ahead. What's your question?
Yeah, so one question I have, what does that mean as far as like created first? So if I was like brand new to this, like how would you explain that to me?
So we have these gods, they create this world, and this is the Forgotten Realms. And then this war breaks out between what we'll call, they're the gods, and then you have what are called the Primordials. And so a primordial is not a demigod in like the sense of Greek mythology. They were the children of gods who had much, much less power. The primordial gods are, I guess, more like lesser gods, as you would think of it. So the gods have created this new world, and as they're wielding the powers of creation, these primordials come into being. And the primordials are dwelling in the Forgotten Realms and on the world, and they are disagreeing with some of the decisions being made by the gods, which leads to a war, which is called the Dawn War. And so this is a war between these primordials and the gods. Yeah, so that's how the very first world starts. So essentially you have this god called Ao, right? An easy way to remember that is A for Alpha and O for Omega, right? So he's called Ao. And he creates what's called Shar and Saloon, which are essentially kind of like good and evil, light and dark. So if you've ever played Baldur's Gate, there's a drow cleric, and her battle cry is for Shar. So you'll hear references to this deity throughout the Forgotten Realms all the time. Creatures that tend towards evil and chaos tend to worship Shar. She's kind of like the god of gods, and there's a lot of lesser deities that they'll favor as well. Whereas conversely, if you played the Baldur's Gate series, you'll encounter Aerie, who's a winged elf, and she'll talk about Saloon, which is light or sun. So okay. Saloon and Shar decide to create the world together, but in the again wielding their powers of creation, they give birth to a pantheon of gods who also will take part in the creation. And then it is this pantheon of gods, both Saloon and Shar and all the gods they've made below them, that go to war with the primordials that have sprung up on this world. Okay. And this is what we call the Dawn War. And this is where we leave the Forgotten Realms, because during the midst of the Dawn War, 3 great dragons leave. They want no part of this. They've decided they want a home and a world, but they're tired of fighting with all the other deities and primordials for the Forgotten Realms. So they leave and find a great just kind of void in space where they begin to create their own world. And here they form the 13 Plains of Eberron. So the 3 dragons are Kyber, Sibius, and Eberron. And once the world is created, a conflict arises between Kyber and Sibius. And Kyber kills Sibius and tears him to pieces. To prevent Kyber from killing Eberron as well, Eberron wraps himself around Kyber and essentially solidifies them into a planet, which is Eberron. Right, so that is where the world of Eberron is created, and the planes that they had created before that together are kind of intersecting like that. You could almost think of it like a solar system, but also kind of like multi-dimensional because they'll bleed into each other, and you can open gates and travel between them.
Very similar, like the 9 realms of Norse mythology.
So yeah, so you have this kind of idea. So yeah, like if you see it on a map, it's often portrayed as kind of a solar system, the 13 planes and Eberron at the center. But like I said, it's more not that they're separated in time and space, but more just cross dimensions that can overlap and be crossed over in certain places.
Okay, wow. So Eberron was the first realm.
No, the Forgotten Realms were first. And
but it was the first one that people could live on, basically.
Yes. So Eberron, as opposed to being a planar sphere, exists in the material plane, right? So that's kind of where it's rooted, whereas the others are not rooted in the material plane. You've got like a fire plane and air and ice and
Does not sound like a fun place to live. Yeah, I'm glad Eberron came around. So
that's where Eberron comes from, right? You have these dragons, and we'll get into more about the conflict between Sibius and Kyber, because that has a lot of impact in how the world of Eberron grows. So I wanted to point out that Eberron is a distinctly different world than the Forgotten Realms, even though they both root in D&D. And jumping forward, the big difference between the Forgotten Realms and Eberron is kind of Eberron's emphasis on the intersection of magic and technology. When you're dealing in the Forgotten Realms, it's very classic fantasy style, right? The wizards may start a fire, or they conjure a fireball in combat, but magic and technology don't really intersect. Whereas in Eberron, they do all the time. And that's kind of why I wanted to talk about the Warforged today. So if you listen to Kasric's story, then when he washes up on the shores of Korthros, the first 2 people he meets is Jeets the Halfling and Talbaron the Warforged. And the Warforged is very much an effective symbol of the great differences between Eberron and the Forgotten Realms. So the Warforged were a group of, I guess, golems is a good way to name it. So they were created, but they gained true intelligence during their creation. And so Talbaron is a Warforged. And so they were all created for what's called the Last War. And the Last War it's a proper name, not just the war that happened last time, but during the First World War, it was often referred to as the Great War, but it was also referred to as the war to end all wars. And so that name for World War I is similar to how the name the Last War is being used in Eberron. It's kind of a hopeful idea that there will never be another great war again.
Okay. So it's not like we're all going to die. It's more like we don't want anything like this to ever happen again.
So the Warforged are created to fight in the Last War. Okay. And then when the Last War ends and the treaty is signed, there are 2 conditions to the treaty that affect the Warforged. One is that they were kind of slaves to whoever they were sold to once they were created. And so they are freed as part of that treaty. And secondly, because they are just machines of war, that all the technology and secrets used to create them will be destroyed, and there will be no more Warforged.
Oh, okay. So are there more after this war?
They're in existence. So Kasric's story takes place about 20 years after the Last War. So any Warforged, the oldest would be, 20 to maybe 30 at the oldest, and the youngest could be as young as 2 or 3 because that's when the treaty was signed. So the Warforged, like I said, they really represent Eberron because they're this combination of technology and magic fusing together to create this machine of war, but it has true intelligence to the point that it's considered its own race, and so much so that if they choose to worship a deity, the deities do imbue them with power. So you'll see them as clerics and paladins and and other,
okay.
So like I said, even the gods who rule over Eberron respect the Warforged as their own race of people.
If you feel like you just have a bunch of money just sitting around and you don't know what to do with it, take $1 out of your wallet and just go put it in our jar. Head on over to Patreon, make it happen, because we can actually really use that to keep making you these awesome lore videos. Okay, I understand. Speaking of clerics and paladins, I know you've been talking about this gnome a lot, but doesn't he have acquaintances, I would probably say at this point?
Acquaintances. I guess when he first washes up on the shore, he meets a group of people, right? So you would have met them in the narrative. He meets Jeet, who is a rogue, and Talbron, who's a wizard Warforged, and then Selimus, the cleric. But yeah, so the Warforged, they are essentially, they're beneath it, their very core, it's kind of a metal frame with tubes pouring a magical kind of liquid of life that's similar to blood. And then layered on top of that is either plant fibers or leather that functions as kind of a muscle. And then on top of that, they have either stone or metal plates placed on them. And so they're often, a derogatory term for Warforged because of that is trees. Sometimes people just call them stupid trees.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the other
nicest thing.
Yeah, and then the other insult for the Warforged is a robot, right? They call them robots, which is kind of downplaying their independence and intelligence.
Okay.
And self-awareness. So, and another key feature of them is while they have a face, it doesn't move. They have like a mouth and two eyes built onto them, but it's not a facial feature that moves. And so they communicate emotion through the change of color of their eyes. So
do the eyes change color? Or do they how do they convey that much with just their eyes?
Well, it's probably, less than you're going to get with a standard, human face, because the colors are just a little bit less expressive unless you're finally acute to the simplest. But you've got blue, green, red, yellow, orange, purple, black. All of these different colors are going to communicate a different emotion that the Warforged is feeling at any given time. But that's all you get. The face is never going to move. It's got no fiber or muscle to it that could move. It's kind of just a metal plate stuck on there that looks like a face.
All right, so are they cyborgs or are they not even alive?
So they're considered alive. Like I said, the deities consider them alive, and most of the other races consider them alive as well. Now, like I said, there are various derogatory terms that people use that kind of designate that they don't respect them as alive. And there's even a large, anti-Warforged group of people who think they should be dismantled. They're like, these are the machines of war. And it's the kind of war we never, I guess the way that some of the people feel about the Warforged is like how people feel about nukes, right? Get rid of all the nukes. They're just weapons of war. And that's how some of the people feel about the Warforged. Get rid of all the Warforged. They're just machines of war.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess my next question, speaking of getting rid of all the nukes, we had a Cold War phase. Did they have anything in Eberron that was kind of similar with the Warforged, where they were just like, we got all these guys, we might start another war, we might not?
So there is a faction. So there is a Warforged referred to as the Lord of Blades. And there's a lot of debate around who he is. Some say he was the first Warforged ever made. Some say he was the last Warforged ever made. So the war was fought by the 5 nations of Eberron, and we'll go into those later. But during the signing of the treaty, the kings from the nations attended this huge meeting and signed this treaty. And one of the kings had brought his Warforged assistant. And there's also a theory that maybe this is the Lord of Blades. He was there when the treaty was signed that essentially doomed his race, right? That the Warforged are the last of their kind, right? There will be no more. And, that's kind of a part of all of the Warforged now, that weight that there will be no more of them. They are the last of their kind. And at the same time, they, like I said, the oldest Warforged is, 30 years at most. And so no one knows how long they'll even live. Like, how long will these Warforged last? 60, 70 years, 1,000 years? No one even knows because they're still so new in the world.
Okay.
But yeah, so the Lord of Blades believes that the Warforged should rule over all of the other races of Eberron, and he has built a group of followers, kind of an army, and fled to a place called the Mournlands, and he is ever trying to recruit more Warforged to join his army as he prepares for a war against all the other races.
Sounds like a great guy. So they can't reproduce. So like, no matter how long they live or whatever, once they're done, they're gone.
Yes.
Okay. Interesting. He can win the war and rule over everyone, but eventually they will just die out. Yeah, super cool.
So, and there's a multitude of Dungeons and Dragons adventures that center around the Warforged. With, I guess they call it the soul, the intelligence and the life spark and all of that, and finding different ways to manipulate it and transfer it to better and more powerful bodies. While the technology to create the Warforged soul no longer exists, there are artificers and wizards who are working on ways to manipulate the existing Warforged soul.
Oh, so they can move it from one department or body to another. That's kind of cool. I wish I could get an upgrade.
Okay. Yeah. So, and I guess one of the defining features of the Warforged is on the very top of their head, they have this little rune mark. And if you really look close at one of them, you'll see it. And it's supposed to be unique to each Warforged. And the only name really ever given to it is by the dwarves, and they call it the Gore rune, and which means the true purpose mark. And like I said, the Warforged never called it that. Maybe it's just a unique way of marking them to tell them apart in the factory. Who knows? Like I said, no one has ever explained why this was put on the Warforged. Maybe that was destroyed with the secrets of their creation, but it is there and it is unique to each one.
Okay. So they put it there, but they had we have no reasoning as to why. We have guesstimates at best.
Yeah.
Here's a tip. Play Flore episodes while you wait in load screens or elevators. They're pretty much the same thing. And while you're waiting for that load screen to finish, tab over with your browser, hit us up on Patreon. After all, we are filling all those boring load screens for you. And we both know there are a lot of them.
Yeah, and so like I said, the reason I wanted to talk about the Warforged is, one, if you play the game Dungeons & Dragons Online, you encounter them, and it's kind of a shock. Like, the first time I saw them, I'm like, what the heck? Why are there robots in this world? and like, you even encounter them in creation, right? Like, you can create a Warforged. And the reason that the Warforged are so symbolic of Eberron is they really point out the difference between Eberron and the Forgotten Realm. In Eberron, you're going to encounter this mix of magic and technology that you don't see in traditional fantasy. And so you won't see that in the Forgotten Realms, but you will see it in Eberron. And there's some really cool stuff that kind of comes out of it. And a lot of times, whereas some things like airships may be done in the Forgotten Realms with pure magic, in Eberron, you'll see a combination of technology and magic brought together to create that kind of technology. In
your opinion, Eberron's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, and it is cool, but I mean, I love the Forgotten Realms as well. But it is different, and if you're only used to those very traditional fantasies, Eberron can sometimes be a little bit of a shock, being like, "What? They've got robots? What is this?"
But like, it's explained and it makes sense in the world, and it makes sense why there's no more as well. Like,
yes,
why there's none in the other ones, which is really nice and like good from a lore standpoint. I don't know if I have any more questions about that. I feel like that was really information heavy.
Yeah, it was very information heavy. I tried not to dive into anything too deep into anything other than the Warforged, because I was like, I wanted to point out there's a difference between the Forgotten Realms and Eberron. And then I wanted to talk about the one of the first things you'll encounter in Eberron, and how it's really just an iconic symbol of how the world is different than the Forgotten Realms. Because most people who are familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, the Forgotten Realms is what they know, right? Like, whether you've played, with your friends in pen and paper, or whether you've played the games, almost everything is always set in the Forgotten Realms. Like I said, the Baldur's Gate series was a huge success in RPG gaming, way back in the 90s. And then, later on in the early 2000s, you had the Neverwinter Night game series that really took off and did really well. But again, all set in those Forgotten Realms.
Okay. So this one's different, which is a nice change of pace.
So,
okay.
All right.
Well, I guess that's everything we've got to talk about today.
Yeah. So thanks for listening. You can check out the gameplay videos on YouTube, and those will also even have the narrative layered over one of them, so you can kind of see what happened and then how that was converted to the story, if that interests you. And then similarly, you can see kind of a gameplay video with this lore piece layered over it, so you can see some of these things visually that we're talking about as they play out a little bit better.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really awesome. I, for one, am still trying to wrap my head around the Warforged, because they're definitely an interesting concept. But next week we're going to be talking about a little bit more of the adventures and stuff, as I think what we're going to be going into. But we won't know for sure until we do it, so make sure you tune in next week. And now we have given you the floor and foundation. Now go build your own story.